What if everything you've been told about the mark of the beast is wrong? For centuries, the number 666 has haunted our imagination. From the cries of persecuted Christians under Rome to whispers of Emperor Nero's cruelty, from medieval visions of demons branding the damned to reformers declaring the papacy the beast itself. Across oceans and centuries, the prophecy followed, fueling revival preachers, stirring fear of governments, and igniting suspicion of technology. Barcodes, microchips, and digital systems, each generation finding 666 in its darkest fears. But what if the truth was never about technology at all? What if the number was a code, a symbol of allegiance, of loyalty, of ultimate choice? This is the untold story of 666. The mark of the beast, explained. What if everything you've been told about 666 is wrong? For centuries, theologians and scholars have debated the true meaning of the mark of the beast. In this video, we trace the entire interpretive journey from ancient apocalyptic texts to modern understandings, revealing how this symbol has been misunderstood and weaponized throughout history. Welcome. Before we begin, leave a comment with your name, your city, and what time of day you're watching. I want to see who is here with us. Imagine receiving a coded message meant just for your community. You're part of a religious minority facing persecution, and open criticism could mean imprisonment or death. This was the reality for early Christians when the Book of Revelation first circulated. The work emerged during intense Roman oppression, likely under Emperor Domitian's rule around 95 CE. A man named John, exiled to the island of Patmos, wrote this text not as a prediction for distant generations, but as immediate encouragement for believers suffering under imperial power. John used symbolic language for protection. He couldn't name the Roman Empire directly, so he created elaborate visions and mysterious numbers. In Revelation chapter 13, he describes a beast rising from the earth that forces people to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead. The famous number 666 appears here as the beast's number, a detail that would have resonated deeply with his original audience. This wasn't about future technology, but about present political reality. Early Christians understood these symbols through their daily experiences. The mark functioned as a direct counterpart to the seal of God mentioned earlier in Revelation. Where God's people received divine protection, those embracing imperial power accepted the beast's mark. This represented the fundamental choice faced by every Christian in the Roman Empire. Show loyalty to Caesar through required acts of worship or maintain faithfulness to Christ despite the consequences. The number served as coded criticism of the imperial cult that demanded citizens declare Caesar is Lord. This original context reveals the mark's purpose as a symbol of religious allegiance during persecution. It wasn't intended as a literal physical mark that would appear in some distant future. The text provided hope to suffering Christians that their faithfulness would ultimately triumph over imperial power. Now, think with me about how this understanding shifted over time. How did the earliest Christians understand this mysterious number? Almost immediately after Revelation began circulating, church leaders started wrestling with its meaning. They faced a complex symbolic text that required careful interpretation. Different Christian communities developed their own readings based on their local circumstances and the pressures they faced from Roman authorities. Perhaps the most significant early interpreter was Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote around 180 CE. In his work Against Heresies, he dedicates considerable attention to the number 666. He considers several possibilities, acknowledging that the true meaning remains uncertain. One suggestion he offers is that 666 refers to Latinos, which would connect it to the Latin people and, by extension, the Roman Empire. Irenaeus understood the number as representing a specific name or title through the practice of gematria, where letters correspond to numerical values. Other important early writers continued this interpretive tradition. Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the early 3rd century, also engaged with Revelation's symbolism. He saw the number as pointing to a specific opponent of God's people who would appear in the last days. These early interpreters consistently viewed 666 as a cryptic reference to opposition against the Christian faith. They focused on identifying contemporary or imminent threats rather than whatever power stood against God's purposes in their historical moment. Early Christians generally understood the mark of the beast as representing Roman imperial power and its demand for allegiance through emperor worship. The number served as code for the system that persecuted their communities and demanded they deny their faith. This interpretation provided comfort to those facing martyrdom, assuring them that earthly powers would ultimately fall before God's kingdom. The focus remained on spiritual resistance rather than decoding future timelines. Get ready, because medieval interpretations would take a dramatically different turn. What if 666 pointed to a specific Roman emperor? Many modern scholars identify Emperor Nero as the beast referenced in Revelation. This interpretation requires understanding ancient numbering systems that differ greatly from our modern approach. Hebrew and Greek both used letters as numerals, creating a practice called gematria, where words and names could be converted to numerical values. When we write Nero Caesar's name in Hebrew letters, Nun Resh Vav, Nun Kov Samek Resh, and calculate its numerical value, it adds up to exactly 666. This isn't a coincidence, but a carefully crafted code that early Christians would recognize. The name Nero Caesar in Hebrew is spelled Nrvnksr, where Nun equals 50, Resh equals 200, Vav equals 6, Nun equals 50, Kof equals 100, Samech equals 60, and Resh equals 200. The sum totals 666. This identification fits perfectly with the historical context of Nero's brutal persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Nero became the first emperor to systematically persecute Christians, making him the archetypal enemy of the early church. The number may also represent imperial tyranny more broadly, but Nero serves as the primary embodiment of this opposition. Interestingly, some of the most ancient manuscripts actually show the number 616 instead of 666. This variation also works for Nero when using an alternative spelling of his name or when calculating through Latin rather than Hebrew. Codex Ephremi Rescriptus and Papyrus 115 both contain this alternative reading, suggesting early Christians understood this as referring to Nero through different linguistic approaches. The Nero connection provides the most compelling historical evidence for the original referent of 666. It aligns with the timeline of Revelation's composition and the specific persecution context that shaped the text. Early Christians facing Roman oppression would immediately recognize this coded reference to the emperor who had tortured and killed their fellow believers. This interpretation grounds the number in a specific historical reality rather than abstract futuristic speculation. How did the Middle Ages reshape the mark's meaning? As the Roman Empire faded into history, Christian interpreters faced a new challenge. They needed to apply an ancient prophecy to their contemporary world. The symbolic language of Revelation remained powerful, but its target shifted dramatically. Medieval theologians began applying the prophecy to their immediate enemies. During the Crusades, the beast became identified with Islam rather than Rome. Crusading preachers declared that Muslims bore the mark of opposition to Christianity. This interpretation justified holy war and created a new apocalyptic framework for understanding conflict with Islamic powers. Various popes and anti-Christians also found themselves accused of bearing the mark. Reform movements within the church used 666 to criticize corrupt leadership. Different factions calculated the number to match the names of their opponents. This practice turned the mark into a weapon in internal church conflicts. Apocalyptic movements flourished throughout, and various millenarian sects used 666 to identify their theological opponents. They saw themselves as the faithful remnant resisting the marked beast of institutional corruption. The number became a rallying cry for those claiming to represent pure Christianity. The mark took on more supernatural characteristics during this era. People began to imagine it as a literal physical sign that would appear on the damned. Artistic depictions in illuminated manuscripts and church sculptures showed the mark as a visible brand. This shift reflected growing interest in the physical manifestations of spiritual realities. Artists portrayed the mark in increasingly dramatic ways. Paintings showed devils branding sinners with hot irons. Mystery plays depicted characters receiving the mark as a public declaration of evil allegiance. These representations moved the interpretation further from its original symbolic meaning. Medieval interpreters adapted the mark to their historical context with remarkable flexibility. They maintained the concept of opposition to God's people but applied it to new enemies and situations. This approach kept Revelation relevant but often at the cost of historical accuracy. The mark became a tool for identifying and condemning opponents across religious and political divides. This weaponization of prophecy would continue for centuries, with each generation finding new applications for the ancient number. The medieval period established the pattern of reinterpretation that would characterize later centuries. Meanwhile, the Reformation would bring another dramatic shift in how Christians understood this mysterious symbol. How did Protestant reformers reinterpret the mark? The Reformation created entirely new theological frameworks for understanding biblical prophecy. Where medieval interpreters had seen the beast in external enemies like Islam, reformers now looked within Christendom itself. They identified the beast with the Roman Catholic Church and its leadership. Martin Luther and John Calvin both saw papal authority as fulfilling the beast prophecy. Luther initially hoped for reform within the Church, but eventually concluded the papacy represented the Antichrist system predicted in Scripture. Calvin developed this interpretation systematically in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, arguing that the marks of the true Church had been corrupted by Roman practices. The mark became associated with specific Catholic sacraments and practices. Reformers identified it with compulsory confession, mandatory masses, and other requirements they saw as unbiblical additions to Christianity. They argued these practices forced believers to choose between obedience to God and compliance with church authorities. This interpretation provided powerful justification for breaking from Roman authority. If the papacy truly represented the beast prophesied in Revelation, then separation became not just permissible, but necessary for faithful Christians. This theological position fueled the organizational and doctrinal separation of Protestant churches. The Reformation also created new apocalyptic expectations among Protestant groups. Many believed they were living in the final days before Christ's return. They saw their break with Rome as fulfilling end-times prophecies about the fall of Babylon, which they identified with the Catholic Church. Protestant scholars calculated the number 666 using various papal titles and Latin phrases. They applied gematria to terms like Vicarius Filii Dei, Vicar of the Son of God, a title sometimes used for the Pope. When converted to Roman numerals, this phrase could be made to add up to 6666. Other calculations used different papal titles or ascriptions. The Reformation transformed the mark into a potent anti-Catholic symbol that fueled centuries standard in Protestant theology and popular preaching. It provided a biblical basis for opposing Catholic authority and practices. This anti-papal reading of Revelation spread through Protestant publications and sermons. It shaped how generations of Protestants understood their relationship with Catholicism. The mark became a shorthand for everything reformers believed was wrong with the Roman Church. The Reformation's interpretation demonstrated how each generation finds contemporary applications for ancient prophecies. Reformers saw themselves as recovering the original meaning of Scripture while actually creating new interpretations suited to their historical situation. Their reading reflected their specific concerns about church authority and purity. Now think with me about how these interpretations crossed the Atlantic to the New World, where they would take on distinctive American characteristics. The Protestant understanding of the mark became part of the religious framework that European settlers brought to North America. How did the mark evolve in the New World? American religious movements developed unique interpretations that reflected their distinctive cultural context. The young nation saw itself as fulfilling biblical prophecy in ways that differed dramatically from European Christianity. This new environment created fresh applications of the mark of the beast concept that resonated with American experiences and anxieties. Seventh-day Adventists and other restorationist groups refined Mark of the Beast theology in particularly American ways. Following the Great Disappointment of 1844, when Christ's expected return did not occur, these movements sought new understandings of prophecy. They began associating the mark with Sunday worship laws and other specific practices they viewed as compromising biblical truth. The mark became connected to debates about Sabbath observance and religious liberty in the New Republic. American individualism transformed how people applied the prophecy personally. Unlike European state churches, American religion emphasized personal interpretation and individual conscience. People began seeing the mark not just as an institutional reality, but as something that could affect them personally. This created anxiety about accidentally receiving the mark through everyday actions or decisions. These interpretations often reflected cultural anxieties about government control and institutional power. As the federal government expanded its reach in the 19th and 20th centuries, some saw this as fulfillment of the beast's rising authority. The number 666 appeared in conspiracy theories about national institutions, including the banking system, the IRS, and federal agencies. Some claimed to find the number hidden in Social Security numbers, license plates, or government documents. American apocalyptic thought maintained the Protestant anti-Catholic interpretation while adding new layers of suspicion about secular authority. The mark became a symbol for any force that threatened individual religious freedom or conscience. This blending of religious and political concerns created a distinctively American approach to interpreting Revelation. The personalization of the mark prophecy made it particularly powerful in American culture. People worried about compromising their faith through seemingly minor actions or associations. This anxiety fueled numerous books, sermons, and later films and television programs exploring how the mark might manifest in modern life. American interpretations maintained the basic concept of the mark representing opposition to God, but applied it to contemporary religious and political issues unique to the American experience. The focus shifted from identifying historical enemies to against potential future threats, feeling immediate and relevant to each new generation. Get ready, because technological advances would create entirely new fears about how the mark might be implemented in the modern world. The American concern with government control and personal freedom would soon find expression in anxieties about new technologies that could monitor or restrict individual choice. What happens when ancient prophecy meets modern technology? The 20th century brought new anxieties about how the mark might be physically implemented. Technological advances created fresh interpretations of Revelation symbolism that moved far beyond earlier historical applications. People began seeing potential marks in everyday objects and systems that previous generations could never have imagined. Barcodes, credit cards, and microchips were all identified as potential candidates for the mark of the beast. When universal product codes appeared on consumer goods in the 1970s, some noticed that the guard bars pattern resembled the number 6. This observation sparked concerns that the technology might conceal the dreaded number. Similarly, credit card numbers and magnetic strips were seen as potential vehicles for the mark, especially as electronic payment systems grew more widespread. The number 666 itself appeared in various product codes and identifiers, fueling these fears. Some computer systems used numbers that included these digits. Government identification numbers sometimes contained the sequence. These occurrences were often coincidental, but they reinforced anxieties about technology being used to control and monitor individuals. The pattern seemed to confirm that technology was becoming the means of implementing the ancient prophecy. These interpretations reflected deeper cultural fears about government surveillance and loss of privacy. The Old War context amplified concerns about state control and the erosion of individual freedoms. People worried that technology would be used to create systems where no one could buy or sell without complying with the authority. This is connected directly to Revelation's warning about economic control through the mark. End times preachers used these technological developments to support their predictions. Books and sermons detailed how various technologies might be used to implement the mark. Some claimed that biometric identification, RFID chips, or digital currency systems represented the fulfillment of prophecy. These interpretations gained traction through radio broadcasts, books, and later television programs and websites. The mark transformed from a religious symbol into a technological threat in popular imagination. Where earlier generations had seen it as representing spiritual allegiance or institutional corruption, many now viewed it as a physical technology that would be Qiangzhai implemented. This shift represented a dramatic change in how people understood and applied the ancient text. Modern technology revived literal interpretations that had been largely absent for centuries. The focus returned to physical implementation rather than symbolic meaning. This created new apocalyptic anxieties that were particularly powerful because they involved technologies people were already using in their daily lives. The fear became immediate and tangible rather than abstract or historical. Now consider how scholarship responded to these popular interpretations that connected ancient prophecy with modern technology. Academic biblical studies developed approaches that challenged these literal readings and sought to reclaim the original context and meaning of Revelation's symbolism. How did academic scholarship change our understanding of the mark of the beast? Biblical studies developed more rigorous historical approaches to Revelation that challenged questioning literal readings of the mark, emphasizing instead the original context of Roman persecution that shaped the text's composition. Scholars recognize that apocalyptic literature functions differently from straightforward prophecy, using symbolic language to address immediate crises rather than predict distant future events. The symbolic nature of apocalyptic literature became better understood through careful literary analysis. Researchers demonstrated how Revelation employs numbers, animals, and cosmic imagery as coded references to contemporary realities. They showed that numbers like 6 and 66 function symbolically rather than literally, representing concepts rather than predicting specific technologies or individuals. This approach shifted focus from decoding future events to understanding the text's original meaning for its first-century audience. Textual criticism revealed significant manuscript variations that complicated literal interpretations. The discovery that some ancient manuscripts contain the number 616 rather than 6666 demonstrated that early Christians understood this as a flexible, symbolic number rather than a fixed prediction. This variation suggested the number served as a coded reference that could be adjusted for different linguistic calculations while maintaining its symbolic meaning. The manuscript evidence supported the view that early readers recognized this as gematria, pointing to Nero rather than a literal number to watch for in future technologies. Academic conferences and journals hosted vigorous debates about the Nero hypothesis and alternative interpretations. Scholars examined linguistic evidence, historical context, and literary patterns to test various theories about the number's meaning. They considered whether it represented Nero specifically, imperial power generally, or other contemporary OPPs, opponents of the Christian community. These discussions moved the conversation away from popular speculation toward evidence-based historical reconstruction. Theological schools developed diverse approaches to interpreting prophecy that acknowledged multiple valid readings. Some emphasized the original historical context, while others explored theological themes that transcended specific historical applications. Most scholarly approaches rejected literal futurist interpretations in favor of understanding Revelation as symbolic literature addressing the tension between God's kingdom and earthly powers. This perspective recognized the text's enduring relevance while respecting its historical particularity. Scholarship largely concluded that the mark represents the choice between allegiance to God or opposition to divine purposes throughout history. The number 666 symbolically embodies complete imperfection or opposition to God's perfect completeness represented by 7. This understanding maintains the text's spiritual challenge while avoiding speculations about specific future implementations. Academic research helped recover the original message of faithful resistance in the face of oppressive power. Meanwhile, popular culture continued to develop its own interpretations that often diverged from scholarly consensus. The gap between academic understanding and popular belief widened as technological advances fueled new literal readings. This divergence demonstrates how ancient symbols continue to resonate with contemporary anxieties even when separated from their original context. How did the mark influence art and literature? The number 666 appears throughout Western cultural history in ways that often diverge from theological interpretations. Artistic representations have transformed this ancient symbol into something both familiar and frequently misunderstood by modern audiences. This cultural journey shows how religious symbols can take on new lives, incorporated apocalyptic imagery into its elaborate vision of hell during the 14th century. While not directly featuring the number 666, Dante drew upon the same tradition of symbolic numbers and divine judgment that characterized Revelation. His work helped establish patterns of imagining damnation that would influence how later artists visualized the mark of the beast. This literary treatment began the process of adapting religious concepts for artistic purposes. Renaissance artists depicted the mark in paintings and sculptures that combined biblical themes with contemporary artistic styles. They visualized the mark as a physical brand or visible sign on the foreheads of the damned. These representations moved the concept further from its original symbolic meaning toward a more literal interpretation. The artistic imagination began shaping popular understanding more than theological scholarship did. Modern films and books used 666 as a horror and suspense device that traded on cultural familiarity with the number. Horror movies featured the number as a sign of demonic possession or supernatural evil. Thriller novels used it to create tension about conspiracies and apocalyptic scenarios. This entertainment-focused approach stripped the number of its historical context and theological significance. Heavy metal music adopted the number as a symbol of rebellion against established authority. Bands used 666 in album titles, lyrics, and imagery to signal their opposition to conventional values. This musical adoption completed the transformation of the mark into a general symbol of defiance rather than a specific religious concept. The number became detached from its original meaning in popular usage. Cultural representations often simplified and sensationalized the mark, distorting its original meaning as a coded reference to Roman persecution. The complex historical context gave way to dramatic imagery and simplistic associations with evil. This process demonstrates how symbols can maintain their power while losing their specific historical grounding. The number continues to resonate even as its original significance fades from popular awareness. Now think with me about what archaeological evidence reveals about how early Christians actually understood and responded to this concept in their daily lives. The material record provides tangible evidence that sometimes contradicts popular assumptions about marks' meaning and significance in early Christian communities. What physical evidence exists for these interpretations of the mark of the beast? Archaeology provides tangible evidence of how early Christians actually understood and used the Book of Revelation in their daily lives. The material record often contradicts popular assumptions that have developed over centuries about what the mark represented to its original audience. Ancient manuscript discoveries show significant variations in the number itself. The earliest surviving copies of Revelation don't agree on whether the number is 6666 or 616. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, a 5th century manuscript, contains the 616 reading. Even more remarkably, Papyrus 115 from the 3rd century also shows this alternative number. These variations suggest early Christian copyists understood this as a flexible symbolic reference rather than a fixed prediction. The number could be adjusted slightly while maintaining its essential meaning as a coded reference to opposition. Early Christian symbols found in archaeological contexts focus consistently on hope and salvation rather than fear of the mark. The catacombs of Rome contain numerous examples of Christian art featuring fish, anchors, and shepherd motifs. These symbols emphasized community identity and divine protection. The absence of beast imagery in early Christian material culture suggests they understood Revelation's warnings as metaphorical rather than centered on positive symbols of faith. Artifacts from periods of Roman persecution provide crucial context for Revelation's composition. Documents like the Libellus certificates from the Decian persecution show how the Romans required citizens to prove they had sacrificed to the emperor. These certificates demonstrate the exact kind of imperial loyalty tests that Revelation's mark warning addressed. Archaeological evidence confirms the historical reality of the pressure Christians faced to conform to Roman religious requirements. Excavations at sites like Ephesus and Pergamum reveal how Christians navigated imperial demands in cities specifically mentioned in Revelation. Inscriptions and architectural remains show the prominence of emperor worship in these urban centers. The physical layout of temples and public spaces demonstrates how difficult it would have been to avoid participating in civic religious ceremonies. This evidence supports the view that Revelation addressed immediate practical challenges rather than distant future concerns. These archaeological findings generally support both the Nero hypothesis and an early dating for Revelation's composition. The material evidence aligns with the view that the number referred to contemporary imperial power rather than future technological developments. Artifacts confirm that first-century Christians faced real pressure to demonstrate loyalty to Roman authority through religious acts. The physical record helps reconstruct the historical situation that produced this mysterious number. Get ready, because we need to examine the number itself more closely to understand why 666 specifically carried such symbolic power in the ancient world. The numerical properties and cultural associations of this number reveal deeper layers of meaning beyond simple gematria calculations. Why 666? What makes this number significant in biblical literature? The answer lies in understanding ancient symbolic numbering systems that differ greatly from modern mathematical thinking. The number itself carries deep symbolic meaning within the context of Revelation's apocalyptic vision. Different numbering systems used in the ancient world create various interpretive possibilities that modern readers often miss. In Hebrew numerology, the number 6 represents imperfection or falling short of divine completeness. 7 symbolizes perfection and wholeness throughout biblical literature, appearing repeatedly in creation accounts, ritual practices, and prophetic visions. 6, by contrast, represents something incomplete or inadequate. This symbolic meaning would have been immediately apparent to Revelation's original readers, familiar with Jewish numerical symbolism. 666 emphasizes this concept of complete imperfection or total opposition to divine completeness. The repetition intensifies the symbolic meaning, creating a number that represents the ultimate opposition to God's perfect order. This pattern of triple numbers appears elsewhere in Revelation with different values, always serving to emphasize and intensify the symbolic meaning. The number functions as a symbolic contrast to the divine, rather than a literal count or prediction. The number may also represent a specific name through gematria calculations, as we've seen with Nero Caesar. However, the symbolic meaning operates independently of any specific referent. Even without identifying a particular name, the number conveys the concept of thoroughgoing opposition to divine purposes. This dual function, both symbolic and referential, makes it particularly powerful within the text's literary structure. Other numbers in Revelation carry similar symbolic significance that reinforces this pattern. The number 7 appears 54 times, representing divine perfection and completeness. The number 4 signifies the earthly creation, while 12 represents a symbolic universe where numerical values convey theological concepts rather than mathematical quantities. Understanding ancient mathematics and symbolic systems is crucial for proper interpretation. People in the ancient world viewed numbers as carrying inherent qualitative meaning, not just quantitative value. This perspective differs fundamentally from modern mathematical thinking, which generally treats numbers as neutral quantities. Recognizing this difference helps prevent misinterpretations that project modern assumptions onto ancient texts. The number 666 ultimately represents complete imperfection and opposition to God's purposes, regardless of specific historical reference. It symbolizes whatever system or power sets itself against divine authority and seeks to compel allegiance away from proper worship. This symbolic meaning remains consistent across different interpretations and applications throughout history. Now consider how different Bible translations handle this number, and why some versions show variations in the actual numerical value presented to readers. Why do some Bibles show different numbers for the mark of the beast? The answer lies in manuscript evidence that reveals fascinating variations in the number itself. When you examine the most ancient copies of Revelation, you discover that early Christian scribes didn't all record the same number. This textual variation challenges many assumptions about how literally we should interpret this famous passage. Two significant ancient manuscripts contain the number 616 rather than the familiar 666. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, a 5th century manuscript preserved in Paris, shows this alternative reading. Even more remarkably, Papyrus 115 from the 3rd century, discovered in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, also contains the 6116 variant. These aren't minor copying errors, but substantial differences that appear in highly respected ancient sources. Textual critics continue debating which reading was original to John's writing. Some scholars argue that 666 represents the original number, while others suggest 616 might have been the initial reading. The debate involves careful analysis of manuscript traditions, linguistic patterns, and historical context. Both numbers have strong arguments supporting their authenticity within different manuscript families. What's particularly interesting is that both numbers work for Nero Caesar when using different linguistic approaches. The Hebrew spelling of Nero Caesar calculates to 6166, while a Latinized version or alternative spelling can yield 616. This flexibility suggests early Christians understood they were working with a symbolic reference rather than a fixed numerical prediction. The number could vary slightly while maintaining its essential meaning. These manuscript variations present a significant challenge to simplistic literal interpretations. If the number itself wasn't fixed in the earliest traditions, then reading it as a precise prediction about future events becomes problematic. The variations suggest that early Christian communities understood this as a flexible symbolic reference rather than a specific number to watch for in the coming centuries. The existence of these alternative readings demonstrates that early Christians focused on the symbolic meaning rather than the exact numerical value. They recognized that the number pointed to Nero as the embodiment of opposition to God's people, but the specific digits could vary depending on linguistic calculation methods. This perspective allowed for different communities to maintain the essential meaning while using slightly different numbers. These textual variations support the view that early readers understood the number as symbolic rather than literal. They were comfortable with minor variations because the essential meaning remained consistent across different modern attempts to find exact numerical predictions in the text. The manuscript evidence shows that the number functioned as coded language pointing to Nero's persecution rather than a mathematical puzzle about future technology. Early Christians were more concerned with the symbolic meaning than with numerical precision. This understanding allowed the text to maintain its power across different communities and translation traditions. Meanwhile, modern theology continues to develop new understandings that build upon this historical evidence while addressing contemporary questions about how to interpret ancient prophecy in our current context. How do contemporary theologians understand Mark? Recent theology offers diverse approaches to interpreting this ancient symbol, with scholars disagreeing about how to apply first-century prophecy to modern contexts. Some see the mark as representing all opposition to God throughout history, rather than a single historical referent. They view it as a symbolic warning about any system that demands ultimate allegiance away from divine purposes. This approach maintains the text's relevance while avoiding specific predictions about future events. Others interpret the mark specifically through Christological lenses, seeing it as representing whatever opposes Christ's teachings and kingdom values. They focus on how the mark contrasts with the seal of God, creating a theological framework for understanding spiritual allegiance. This perspective emphasizes ethical choices rather than end-time speculation, encouraging believers to examine where they place their ultimate loyalty in daily life. Liberation theology reads Revelation as resistance literature for oppressed people, applying the mark concept to modern systems of injustice and marginalization. Scholars in this tradition see the mark as representing economic exploitation, political oppression, or social exclusion that prevents full human flourishing. This interpretation connects the ancient text to contemporary struggles for justice and dignity, seeing the mark as whatever dehumanizes or excludes people from full community participation. Postmodern approaches emphasize multiple valid interpretations rather than seeking a single definitive meaning. These theologians acknowledge that different communities will understand the mark differently based on their historical context and social location. They focus on how the symbol functions within communities rather than attempting to decode one universal meaning. This perspective values diverse readings while maintaining the text's transformative potential. Theological schools continue debating literal versus symbolic readings, though most contemporary scholarship favors symbolic interpretations. Academic theologians generally reject futuristic predictions in favor of understanding the mark as a theological concept about allegiance and opposition. They emphasize that the original context of persecution shaped the text's imagery, and that its primary meaning addressed immediate concerns rather than distant future events. Modern theology generally favors symbolic interpretations that focus on ethical choices rather than future predictions. The mark becomes a lens for examining where we place our ultimate loyalty in daily life, rather than a code to decipher about coming events. This approach maintains the text's spiritual challenge while grounding it in practical discipleship rather than speculative prophecy. The focus shifts from predicting the future to discerning faithful response in the present. Now think with me about what this means for us today, as we consider how this interpretive history shapes our understanding of truth-seeking and scriptural interpretation across generations. What does this journey through interpretations of the mark teach us about how it reveals consistent patterns in how we approach sacred texts across generations? We see how each era interprets prophecy through the lens of its own specific fears and contemporary anxieties. This pattern repeats across civilizations and centuries, showing our tendency to read ancient symbols through modern concerns. We consistently observe the temptation to identify others as bearing the mark rather than examining our own allegiances. From medieval accusations against popes to modern suspicions about technology, the mark becomes a way to project evil onto opponents. This pattern reveals more about our human need to categorize and condemn than about the text's original meaning. The interpretive process often serves our desire to identify clear enemies rather than understand complex symbols. The history shows our tendency toward literal readings during times of uncertainty and crisis. When societies face upheaval or fear, people gravitate toward concrete interpretations that promise clarity. This pattern appears during the Reformation, in American apocalyptic movements, and in modern technological anxieties. Literal readings provide a sense of control and predictability when the world feels unstable. True understanding requires embracing historical context and scholarly humility. We must recognize that ancient texts spoke to their original audiences in ways that may not directly correspond to our modern situations. This demands careful study of language, culture, and historical circumstances rather than jumping to immediate applications. The most responsible interpretations acknowledge both the text's historical particularity and its enduring spiritual challenge. The seeker's journey involves continually pursuing deeper understanding rather than settling for easy answers. This process requires recognizing that our interpretations often reveal more about ourselves than about the text. Our fears, biases, and cultural assumptions shape how we read these ancient words. The most valuable interpretations are those that remain open to correction and deeper insight. This interpretive history ultimately teaches us about the human condition, our fears, our need for certainty, and our struggle to find meaning in mysterious texts. It shows the importance of reading scripture with attention to original context, literary genre, and theological purpose. The mark continues to challenge readers to examine where they place their ultimate loyalty, just as it did for first-century Christians facing Roman imperial power. The resolution of this seeking is not final answers but deeper questions about faithful interpretation. We learn that responsible reading requires humility, historical awareness, and openness to multiple dimensions of meaning. The text's power lies not in predicting specific future events but in continually challenging readers to examine their allegiances in every generation. Now we arrive at our final considerations about what this means for understanding divine mystery through changing historical circumstances. The mark of the beast represents humanity's ongoing quest to understand divine mystery through changing historical circumstances. This interpretive journey reveals our need to find relevance in ancient texts while respecting their original context. From early Christian persecution to modern technological fears, each generation has seen its own reflection in this ancient symbol. The challenge remains to read with both historical awareness and spiritual openness. Thank you for joining this exploration of one of Scripture's most enduring mysteries. Thank you for watching. See you soon.